Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective. And today we're going to be talking about Aristotle and Ayn Rand, part two. We did a part one a couple months ago. So if you haven't seen that, check that out. Today we're going to be answering some of your questions that were sent in last time, as well as some questions you're free to send in today via Super Chat. So go ahead and do that. And by we, I don't really mean me, but leave a like and hit that join button. And let's meet our resident philosopher. It's Greg Salmieri. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, and I was resident, but I'm happy to reside here for the moment.
I just use that word kind of like to mean you're here at the moment.
Okay.
So let's start with a question that I had last time, but to kind of set the stage for it, can you refresh what you said? Something like Robert Stadler in Atlas Shrugged is kind of Aristotelian. If you remember saying that, can you explain what you meant?
I mean, I think he's meant to capture a Platonic premise that separates theoretical reasoning from production and in reality. But that premise is unfortunately a big part of Aristotle. So I think if you think of Aristotle, Stadler as in a way the best kind of person who could hold it, in that he's this worldly in his science. He's not mystical in his science. Aristotle too is not mystical in his science. He's fact-based, observation-based, but he thinks that scientific knowledge is of value primarily for its own sake and not for any applications of it to anything else. And in particular, not for any practical applications, which there may be, but you'd be sort of missing the point if you thought that that's what it was for, and if you were too oriented towards it. And indeed, if you look at the introduction to Aristotle's metaphysics, he talks about even practical arts, like crafts, like knowing how to build something. What's honorable about it is not that it produces the result, but it's even more honorable because of the intelligence involved in it. And once we learned to use intelligence in those ways, we went on to these even higher forms of intelligence that have no practical use and are all the more admirable because of that. And the highest of those is philosophy or wisdom, which lets you know about the ultimate causes of things. He does also think reason is involved in production, but that's not the main use of it. There are three. You can use reason to make things. You can use reason to make good decisions about the shape of your life. That's what virtue involves, virtue of character. But the highest uses are using reason for its own sake to understand the nature of the universe.
Knowledge. And Robert Stadler in Atlas Shrugged, he's horrified that this amazing sort of tool or a type of engine that he comes across will be used for a commercial purpose, kind of like that's degrading. And Ayn Rand kind of uses Stadler as sort of an example, I guess, of like a scientist who doesn't quite understand like the full role of science in human life, if that's a fair summary. Now, what I was going to ask,
would say,
go ahead.
In the case of Stadler, it's not so much that he's horrified that the science will be used for a practical purpose. He's fine with if it so happens to be. What he's horrified by is that the guy who created it in order to serve this practical purpose, and he didn't publish his results and go. He was excited about it because it would make an engine. He viewed the practical purpose as the goal of it, rather than he was excited to have discovered a new law of nature. That was all he was interested in, and he would be fine if someone else then went on to make an engine out of it. I think that's Stadler's view. He's not offended that something should be made of it. He just, if you think that's what it's for, if that's why you love the science, if that's central to your valoration of it, you're missing the point. You're being kind of plebeian. And you could see it again with Reardon metal. He describes it as a excellent piece of smelting, right? Like, so, that's nice. It's good. But, you imagine him patting the person on the head, in a condescending way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this sort of condescending view of production and of commercial enterprise, we see it through history, and I get it sounds like Aristotle and then his sort of literary maybe embodiment in a sense, Stadler, kind of hold this premise that commercial ventures, they may be necessary and even somewhat virtuous, but your highest calling as a thinker ought to be kind of thinking for the discovery of truth for its own sake. So what I was going to ask last time, but didn't have time for, I was going to say, is Atlas Shrugged to Aristotle as the Fountainhead is to Nietzsche?
No, I don't. I think that's a little too far, because I think essentially Rand rejects what she regards as all the things she regards as central to Nietzsche, and she keeps only things that she regards as peripheral. He had a certain flair and a certain style. Whereas what Rand regarded as the central or most important thing about Aristotle is the primacy of existence, the laws of logic, and she certainly retains allegiance to those in Atlas Shrugged. Indeed, she names the three parts of the book for the laws of Aristotelian logic, the axioms of Aristotelian logic. She quotes Aristotle, or has Ragnar Danastuhl reading from him in the very last pages from Metaphysics book Gamma. And she says in the afterword that she acknowledges her only philosophical debt is to Aristotle. So there's not a kind of rejection of him. However, there is, I think, in this sense, I think there's something to the comparison you're making, which is that there's a criticism of Nietzsche implicit in the plot of the Fountainhead, particularly in the story of Gail Wynand. And I think there's a criticism of an important element in Aristotle in the story of Stadler. The difference is, one, it's not what she took to be the essence of Aristotle, and two, I doubt she even had Aristotle in mind when she wrote Stadler's story. I mean, a lot of people have this kind of view. Aristotle is unfortunately a major forerunner of it, but I don't think I doubt that fact about Aristotle would have been present in her mind when she was writing it, whereas I'm pretty sure the way in which Wynand is a Nietzschean was, to mind for her when she wrote that.
Right. There's so much evidence that Nietzsche was, like, even in early manuscripts, right? There were like quotes by, or even in the final draft of the Fountainhead, there was a Nietzschean quote, or am I missing?
There were, in the early draft, she had 4 passages from Nietzsche that stood as the beginnings of each of the 4 sections of the Fountainhead. Then she went down to only having 1 at the beginning. Then she got rid of it because she didn't want the connection. Then when she did the 25th anniversary edition, she quoted that line with an explainer of, I don't agree with Nietzsche, but there's something about the spirit of this line and so forth. And he's very good as a poet. So I don't know, I guess that she eventually brought it back, but only 25 years after she published it. But in addition to that with Nietzsche, that's the positive part of Nietzsche, right? The heroic soul has reference for itself. The negative, the critique of Nietzsche in the Fountainhead, there's letters and things that indicate that she was aware of the Wynand Nietzsche connection. It wasn't just some subconscious thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now we've already got Jonathan Honig sending in a super chat, which we'll get to as soon as we read last time's questions. So anyone else with questions or comments, send them in ASAP so we can make sure to get to them. But I'm going to use my interviewer's privilege to ask another question. And this just occurs to me after all the conversations I've had with Jason Rines about ancient Greece. Was Aristotle certainly one real person, or is it kind of a conglomerate of people? Like, is he in fact one person, to your knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, as sure as you can be of ancient people. Now, not everything that comes down to us as the corpus of Aristotle is by that one person, but the things that are not have been identified as such long ago, and there are a couple of borderline case things. So, and it's not like where maybe there were 80 guys, we have no idea, like the
Homer.
Well, I was thinking of the doctors, the Hippocratic corpus. There's no particular reason to think there was a guy, Hippocrates, that most of these things were by. In the case of Aristotle, we have a lot of, they're too similar in style. We have a lot of testimony from contemporaneous people about him, etc. However, whenever you have a very famous author, Plato or Aristotle, there gets to be a literary genre of people doing, their fanfic of him or whatever. Mm-hmm. And there are pseudo-Aristotle texts and pseudo-Plato texts, but they're, kind of on the margins, and it's pretty much known which ones are like that.
Okay, fair enough. Now, last time Daniel asked, could you discuss the connection between Aristotle's tabula rasa in De Anima, and current understanding on consciousness / the subconscious?
Let's see. Well, whose current understanding? People disagree. So, in general, the idea of tabula rasa, Aristotle talks about the mind as being like a blank thing that gets written on. The idea is that knowledge, and this kind of idea is later picked up by John Locke and others, and by the Thomist tradition. The idea of tabula rasa, that's just Latin for blank slate, is that the mind doesn't come pre-stocked with knowledge. All of the knowledge we have is derived from experience. So in sense perception, we take in information, and everything we know is either what we took in sense perception or based on some kind of processing or working up or development of that material. That's what I take the idea of tabula rasa to mean. That's what it means in Aristotle. The current people rail against tabula rasa these days sometimes. I think of people like Steven Pinker and Jonathan Haidt and some psychologists and so forth. I think of Steven Pinker's book, The Blank Slate, claiming that for the mind to be tabula rasa is for it to have no identity at all. And what it would be to be tabula rasa is there's nothing in the mind, there's no identity in the mind, no nature to the mind, in particular, no nature that differentiates some human beings from others. So like if you assume that, I don't know, there are some differences between men and women innately, or whatever it might be, differences in aptitudes or intelligence or in temperament or anything like that, among people, that if we're tabula rasa, that couldn't be the case. I don't see any reason to think that. Aristotle certainly didn't think that there could be no differences. He thought, alas, that men were smarter than women, and people from around the Greek-speaking area better than the barbarians in all sorts of ways, and people were divided into natural masters and natural slaves. So he thought there were all kinds of differences between people, differences that I think there aren't, but there presumably are some differences. And believing that all knowledge comes in through the senses and is developed on there didn't prevent him from doing that. And the blank slate metaphor doesn't prevent you from thinking that. Blank slates are different from one another. What they have in common is that they don't have any writing on them. But they could be harder or softer than one another. They have to be a certain amount hard to be a slate at all, and such that it's possible to chisel into them. But they're going to be different, and maybe there'll be different types of marble and different grains in it and so forth. And likewise, to call human beings tabula rasa, to say we have no knowledge born into us, is just to say we have no knowledge born into us. We could be different in all sorts of other ways, some of which might even be relevant to what kind of knowledge we can acquire. So if you have eyes and functioning vision, you can acquire knowledge of colors. And if you are blind, you can't, or at least not in the normal manner. And there could be all sorts of other differences. Some people could have higher propensities for intelligence or lower, or there something could be physiologically different about their emotional mechanism such that shows up in their temperament. I think people are generally too quick to assume they can tell what things are innate and what differences are innate. But and almost anything we have a word for is almost certainly almost any trait of human beings we have a name for is a trait of developed human beings that almost certainly has multiple components in it, including what they've learned, their choices, and whatever innate things make it possible. So I think people who go about saying they found the gene for this or that, or they know people from this population are this way versus that way, are almost always way ahead of their skis. But tabula rasa doesn't preclude that. Now, Rand talks about tabula rasa a number of places, and she says that it precludes having innate values. And I think that's true, but then you have to really think about what a value is. If a value is any kind of attraction to something, like that sweetness feels pleasant and almost everybody likes sweet things, well, that's born into us. But what's meant by a value is something more than that. It's something that you set yourself to pursue over time. You choose it in base of a kind of understanding of what it is. And something like the appealingness of sugar is, I think, at best a kind of proto-value.
Okay. So I don't have any follow-ups to that, but I'll move on to the next question. Enric asks, last time, Aristotle's view of friendship and love to Rand's. I guess he means, can you compare the two? Friendship and love.
There's a really nice paper by Alan Gotthelf, my old teacher and collaborator, called Philosophy of Love, Aristotelian versus Platonic, or a philosophical approach to love, Aristotelian versus Platonic, that then covers Rand as a variant of the Aristotelian. It's never been published as a text, but I'm pretty sure through the Ayn Rand bookstore you can get an audio recording of it with a question period. So I think that's the best source on that. That will be published as a written paper in the next Ayn Rand Society book. But basically, Alan's view is that the essence of a Platonic view of love, and I mention this because I think you can understand what he thinks about Aristotle by contrast to it, is that love comes from a place of incompleteness, where we're striving to be complete and we're not, and love is something that brings us beyond ourselves towards something better. Whereas an Aristotelian view of love, as Alan understands it, and this is based on some of Aristotle's discussions of friendship, is that the value of a friend is that it's a kind of aesthetic value, like the value of an artwork. It gives you a chance, being with your friend lets you contemplate something that you love about the friend, which you could not contemplate without him. What is it that you're contemplating? Well, basically your shared virtues and values. So what makes the friend a friend to you and what makes you value him is that he has traits that you love in yourself. And he's another yourself. He's another person who is like you in the respects that you value yourself. And when you're with him, you see these features, which are the features that are most important to you about you, in someone else. When you're doing stuff with him, and he thinks friends, the point of friendship is to engage in activities together with your friends, right? You friends live together, but by live together, we don't mean they share the same house, or they might, but they do whatever it is they do together. So if they're musicians, they play together. If they're philosophers, they think and discuss together. If they're merchants, they run a store together. Whatever they do it together. And their friendship consists in this joint activity, and each one gets this external perspective on what he values about the activity and the way he performs it in the other person being like that. And that joyous perspective on the shared activity kind of reinforces and makes you double down on the activity and just get more out of it.
Mm-hmm. And
I think that at that level of abstraction, I think that's true of Rand's view of friendship as well, or of spiritual relationships, that they're based on common values. They're based on, they come from a place of self-esteem and give you a kind of perspective on what you love, including loving yourself, especially. Mm-hmm.
And if you still are friends with someone after living with them, that's true friendship, I say. When someone passes away, like, you're not only losing them, you're losing like who you are when you're around them, right? It's like there's like this, like, a part of yourself. So there's a sad note.
That's a good point too. It's not a point I think Aristotle in particular makes, or Rand, but I think it's true that there are sides of us that are brought out by our friends. There's a way in which you could exaggerate that, and it could be unhealthy. You know, you're a different person when you're with this guy than that person, but don't think of it that way. I mean, there are people like that, but being with different friends gives you opportunities to have scope for different of your interests, different of the things you do, to bring out different sides of yourself, to go deep on different sides of yourself. And there's a whole kind of repartee and relationship and way of being that you have with each friend or friend group, and that changes when they're gone. That's true.
All right. Frank last time asked, how does Aristotle's golden mean fit in with his general philosophy, if any?
He never really uses the phrase golden mean, but he does talk about means, and people have used that. In Aristotle's ethics, right, he thinks that the goal of life Everything should be directed at this ultimate end, fully living a human life. And that means developing and exercising the virtues that enable us to, enable reason to play its full role in human life, to that perfect reason and its role in our life to the utmost. And there are basically two broad categories of virtues. There are intellectual virtues, which are in effect bodies of knowledge and intellectual skill that make you think well. They involve knowing the truth and having a kind of facility with it in a given area, and there are a bunch of these. But for example, a science would be one of these. So if you have the science of geometry, that means you understand about shapes and you're good at thinking about them. And that's a virtue that you would have, a science. But so that's one category of virtues, the so-called intellectual virtues. And there's a second category, the characterological virtues. And the virtues of character aren't exactly abilities to reason, but they're the fact that your emotions are reasonable. They're in accord with reason. And so you have a lot of different kind of emotions or motives. You sometimes you want to eat, and sometimes you are afraid, and sometimes you want to raise a laugh, and so forth. And there are ways with respect to each of these that you could be irrationally driven by this emotion. Too much. You want to eat and have sex and so forth all the time in a way that's not good for you. Or alternatively, you're not engaging in these kind of motivations enough. You're an ascetic and you're not getting the pleasure out of life that there is to be from food and drink and sex and so forth. So there's a kind of reasonable way, a reasonable amount to indulge in, engage in, use various emotions and motives. And that amount is always, Aristotle thinks, going to be between too much and too little. This is assuming we're talking about a motivation or emotion that's actually part of a good life. It's going to be part of a good life in the right amount, in the right way, at the right time, in the right place. Some things are just bad and you shouldn't have them in your life, like, Aristotle, the desire to commit adultery. There's no the right amount to commit adultery. Adultery is the wrong amount, the wrong way to do something else, have sex with someone other than someone else's wife. The mean is this intermediate amount, this rational amount to engage in a certain feeling, emotion, activity. And each virtue of character, there are several of them, 11, is a mean relative to a different motivation. So the mean is central to his account of virtue of character, which is one of the types of virtues. And that's how, and virtue is needed for reason to fully play its role in human life, which is the goal of human life, to live, to realize your nature as a human being, which means to make reason fully function in your life.
So is it right to say that what's largely been attributed to Aristotle, like in casual conversation, casual references, people have said that they've attributed to Aristotle, quote, everything in moderation, but would it be more accurate to say everything in context?
So I think a lot of the moderation is about context. It's about understanding its role in your life and so forth. But also it's not everything. I mean, so some things there's the right amount of is none. And others the right amount of is as much as possible. So it's not like a kind of mealy mouth to have a little bit of everything. It's have the, a rational, reasonable amount of everything. And it often helps to find that amount to understand what it would be to go overboard or underboard. We don't quite have a word for that. But.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
One of the things that's striking about them, he defines these areas relatively narrowly. Like, I gave the example of humor before. That's one of them. There's a mean with humor. And if you go too far, you're a buffoon. You're raising laughs at anyone's expense, no matter what. And if you go the other way, you're someone who objects, like anytime anyone tells a joke. And there's a right amount. You're making fun of the right things in the right way at the right times and so forth. So that's just an example. He's pretty granular with these.
All right. Another guy named Frank says, did Aristotle's teaching help Alexander the Great?
He wasn't taught by him. Alexander had a relatively short time in Aristotle's tutelage before he went and started, invading every place. And their relationship is much speculated on. And it's easy to kind of romanticize. I don't mean like make it a love relationship, but easy to make a grand story about it. And it's hard to know how much is true. They seem to be on good terms. And Alexander was a big proponent of Greek culture and learning. So one could assume that was Aristotle's influence, but we don't know the details.
All right. And those are all the questions from last time. And then today, Jonathan Honig asked, what, if anything, is in Aristotle's work relates to Miss Rand's benevolent/malevolent universe premise? And he thanks you for your scholarship and work.
That's a good question. Well, the thing that comes to mind first, maybe just associationally, is Aristotle's will begins, all will be well, but in case anything happens to me, I made the following provisions. Now, maybe that's just how wills from that time started. I don't know. But there's something very nice about, like, don't worry, we're cool. But, when I die, here's what should happen. What in his philosophy? I mean, I think he basically has a human beings. Now, unfortunately, he thinks only a subset of us are fully human and fully capable of this. But the ones who are, the free adult men, are capable of really achieving virtue, of really fully living up to their human natures. Those are the people that he's addressing. And he doesn't have an ideal that he thinks is unreachable, whereas Plato does. For Plato, the kind of ideal in life is you can't get it. Now, not everyone's going to reach it because it's demanding and hard, but it is in principle reachable by everybody. One should try and work at it and strive at it, and one can expect, to lead a good life insofar as one puts in the effort to do it. The other aspect of it that I think differentiates Aristotle from particularly later thinkers in the Hellenistic period, the period after his death, is Aristotle is pro-external goods. The external goods are basically money and friends and honor. What makes them external? Well, they're not part of you, as opposed to bodily goods like health and strength, and goods of the soul like virtue or wisdom. The later philosophers very much have this idea, who the hell knows what's going to happen to you? You get some money, the money can get stolen. Anything that you invest yourself in, anything that you think of as part of your happiness or part of your life that's not part of you, that can get taken away. And an instant you're giving hostages to fortune. If you want to be happy, if you've got to divorce yourself from all these things. You've got to, alienate yourself from the world, or kind of disown them. And, you can like when you have something, but don't, care about it too much. This is the Stoics, but also the Epicureans think this way. Aristotle thinks the best things that you could have are part of you, your soul, your character, who you are. That you've got some money isn't the best thing. If you base your happiness all around that, that's a mistake. But you should regard these kinds of things as having a real value in your life. And you should expect that if you're a good person, you'll be able to, maintain your estate, have success in worldly affairs, and you should regard that as part of your happiness. And there could be horrible misfortunes that take them away, and that'll have an effect on you. But one, that's atypical, and two, if you're virtuous, you'll bear those situations as well as is possible, and your happiness will still, though diminished, shine through. So there's a type of worldly ambitiousness. It's a moderate ambitiousness, but ambitiousness for things out in the world and for taking chances and wanting to have them and valuing them, that's in Aristotle, that's not in those later thinkers. And I think that relates to a kind of view of the world as amenable to human success.
All right. And Enric asks, does Aristotle's idea of philosophy for its own sake relate to the current idea of art for art's sake?
In as much as they both regard something as an intrinsic value, as valuable apart from its relation to the rest of life, yes. But I don't know that they're the same kind of view in that sense, that something's of intrinsic value. But views like that are common. A lot of people regard whatever they value as valuable intrinsically apart from its relation to the rest of life. And I don't know that Aristotle was any influence, for example, on the art is art sacred.
All right, and final super chat we've got today is from Justin saying, does Aristotle have a view on motivation?
I mean, not exactly in those terms, but he thinks that we have desires, that our desires can be reasonable or unreasonable, that those desires influence us to act, and that there's also a kind of rational state of understanding goodness that can influence our desires and also in itself be a part of what motivates us to act. And all the details of all of these things are matters of, a lot of dispute among interpreters of Aristotle. So there's a lot of, nuanced questions about them. But yeah, he thinks, we act for what we take to be good or what we experience as pleasure, and how those things relate to one another is an issue of some nuance.
And coming in hot, we've got Eric asking, form and matter are not metaphysical distinctions for Rand. What would Aristotle need to know to agree with her?
Form and matter are not metaphysical distinctions for Rand. Well, insofar as they're not a part of her metaphysics. Insofar as she distinguishes them, they're metaphysical rather than epistemological, but they're, you might think they're more physical. What are they for Aristotle? He doesn't believe in two types of stuff. There's form and there's matter, and they combine to make things. Rather, form and matter are like role concepts, or it's a concept of a relationship. So the context for the concepts of form and matter is the fact that things can come to be and pass away. Among the things that exist, some of them are capable of existing or not. Some of them are capable of ceasing to exist, and they came to exist. When you have something like that, something that can be, but can also fail to be, you can analyze it into two components. You can analyze it into that component which would be there even if the thing went out of existence and was there before the thing came into existence. That component of it which is capable of being the thing in question, but isn't necessarily the thing in question. And that's the matter of the thing in question. So if you have a bronze statue, the bronze statue came to be when someone shaped some bronze like the statue, and it would cease to be when the bronze stopped being shaped that way. So there's the bronze that's capable of being the statue, but also capable of being a whole bunch of other things, not the statue. That would be the matter. And then the form would be that which is present when the statue is the statue and absent when it's not, namely it's being in a particular shape. And it's this metaphor of a bronze statue, or hule, the word for matter is actually a word for wood. So wood, carved thing into the shape of a sphere of stuff and shape. That is the basic idea of form and matter. But it's extended widely for this kind of relationship of potential to be something, plus it's actually being the thing it has the potential to be. And that's what form and matter are. And so anytime you have anything that's capable of coming into and out of existence, this kind of analysis is possible. And at that level of abstraction, I don't think there's anything in objectivism that disagrees with it. Aristotle then has a way of thinking about metaphysics, a way of thinking about physics and natural science that develops this distinction in all sorts of ways. And some of what he thinks in that view is, I think, correct, and others not. But that's matters of relative detail. The overall concept of potentiality and actuality, I think, can be useful in a lot of areas of thinking.
All right. And Mark asks, what's Aristotle's view on romantic relationships?
He says surprisingly little about it. He talks about friendship. He talks about like a kind of type of friendship for pleasure, where he seems to have in mind a kind of casual sex relationship, not casual in that it's one night stands, but like, you're hooking up or whatever, that kind of friendship for pleasure, which he thinks is not, a particularly good form of friendship. It's better than some, but not a particularly deep form. He says that husbands and wives ideally will have character friendship, which is the highest form of friendship, but because it's here between a man and a woman, it'll be a kind of degraded form of it. Because the woman's not going to be as good as a man would be, in his view. But he doesn't really talk much about it. And this is a kind of interesting difference from Plato, who is really captivated by the subject of romantic love. Something that he thinks can happen between a man or a woman. Plato thinks it's sort of better when it happens between a man and an adolescent boy. But he thinks of it as the same kind of relationship that can occur in both senses. And he goes on and on about the kind of infatuation and the intensity and the drama. And, you're outside your beloved's house all night singing sonnets to them. And this kind of romantic comedy almost, this sort of romantic intensity. That's a big part of Plato's account of love, and he's analogizing it to all sorts of things. This is the attitude you can come to have towards wisdom and so forth. Aristotle just doesn't talk much about that.
All right. We've got, thank you, El Dorado, for the 15 shach. That's the Israeli currency. I think that's what that symbol is. Marilyn, thank you for the 10 USD. And thank you, Daniel, for the $5 with no questions. And those are all the questions we have. I'm like a quarter of the way or something into Arthur Herman's book, The Cave in the Light. Have you read that? Are you familiar with that book? It's about the duel between Aristotle and Plato through history. But I've wondered at moments, would an objectivist or would Ayn Rand agree with this author's application of Platonic and Aristotelian influence in history?
I'm sort of glancingly familiar with it. I've read bits of it, but I've not studied it, and I'm not even sure I've read all of it. I've just, thumbed around in it. What I've seen has been, a good popular presentation of that material. I haven't noticed anything I thought was inaccurate, and some of the things discussed in it, I just don't know that much about some of the figures. But so far as I know, it's, pretty good.
Quick example, I'll try to make it quick. He says Martin Luther King signifies an influence of Plato. So I would have assumed, well, that's Aristotelian. It's in terms of what MLK was pushing for, sort of this individualistic, sort of whatever it was he was pushing for, I would associate with Aristotle, but actually it's Platonic, says the author, because he's agitating for change, even radical change, whereas Aristotle was more the type to kind of survey how people are already living and kind of take it for granted and derive certain ethical norms from that. So would you agree that
Plato is more in some ways of a radical than Aristotle. His radicalism is more forward and part of his identity. Let's, get rid of the whole city as we have it and create this whole other kind of institution where we take everyone's kids from them and, have some utopian, I think we would think dystopian kind of state. Generally, Aristotle is a little more respectful of traditions and usually is more incremental in the kinds of changes that he's advocating for, but there are radical elements in Aristotle on certain issues, places where he's more radical than Plato, even certainly on self-love, which Aristotle thinks of as a good thing, rightly understood, and which was a smear word in Greece, philautos, lover of self. He kind of rails against certain inscriptions on temples, which were proverbial wisdom. He's like, this is all wrong. So he's not someone who's always kind of deferring to popular opinion, but he is a little less characteristically on the barricades than Plato is. But he will be for the things that he thinks matter. And now, what about King? I mean, there was Marcus Garvey before and Malcolm X. There were people who were a lot more radical than Martin Luther King in wanting to totally reform or totally change society. So I don't, if you're going to think of where was Martin Luther King in the spectrum of people who want incremental change versus people who want to totally refigure society, he wasn't all the way on the one end of that scale. And I just don't think you can put someone as Platonic Aristotelian because they want change. Mm-hmm. Especially if you don't think about how much change and on what time course and etc. but King seems to me relatively conservative in the sense of demanding a kind of type of change that was practicable within the context of the overall society he was in, and thinking about changing it gradually, faster than some people wanted, but not, let's reboot the thing and start from scratch. For good or bad, I think that's, part of King's method, if you contrast him with other, again, reformers of the time. And then, neither Plato or Aristotle believed in the equality of people, right? So you're at a very abstract level when you're saying, in what way is this figure Platonic or Aristotelian? I think the essence is, are they someone who is essentially otherworldly, believes that virtue is something that disconnects us from life on earth and orients us towards some afterlife? Do they think that knowledge is reached on the basis of observation, or is it somehow reason detached from observation? And again, do they believe in life and happiness on earth? And I think you can see elements of both of those things in most major figures. Certainly, Martin Luther King was a Christian reverend, right? So he's not, but he's not someone who's saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar and accept your fate here on earth. He's saying we can make changes, to be better here on earth, to have a better society and to lead better lives. And there's a tremendous respect in his work for what you can accomplish within your life. There's a wonderful speech about whatever you do it like a great artist. If you sweep the floor, do it like Da Vinci or Rembrandt. That is Aristotelian in that it's, engaged with your life and embodying excellence in your own life day to day. However, it's neither Platonic or Aristotelian in that it's, focused on the value of production in a way that neither of them was. So if you're going to make these grand historical claims, which I think one can about a duel between Plato and Aristotle, to use Rand and Leonard Peikoff's wording, you have to identify the themes at very abstract levels, not to what respect is this person representing respect for reason, respect for reason being this worldly. And you have to understand Aristotle, who's the more this worldly of the two, being an imperfect representative of that side.
Mm-hmm. All right. I've got another fact-checking question about the Cave of the Light if we have time. But right now, friend of Aristotle in the super chat asks, would you say that Rand's idea of humility was Aristotelian?
I'm not sure what you think of as Rand's idea of humility. Rejecting it as bad, as the opposite of pride, or some sense in which he might have said less negative things about it. Aristotle sees, these are always issues of translation. How do we translate the terms? But what you might translate as humility as a vice associated with pride, you don't think enough of yourself. Pride is the virtue of being great and knowing it, in effect. There's no virtue of being all right and thinking you're all right, because if you're just all right, you should try to be great. You should try to get better. And great here means great with respect to virtue, not just, you're good at some particular thing. That's nice too, but that's a different virtue. It's like, what is your quality as a human being? And pride for Aristotle is a virtue you can only have once you're already perfected as a human being. And it's the virtue of knowing and owning your own perfection. And the excess associated with it is regarding yourself as a perfected, exalted human being when you're not, regarding yourself as having the kind of value that a virtuous man would have when you're not virtuous. And that's, vanity and whatever. And the deficiency, the other vice, is regarding yourself as less good than you are. And that is what you might call humility, pusillanimity, smallness of soul. And it's a vice because it makes you not strive, not go for your best, shrink away from challenges that you're worthy of meeting. And I think that's very much Rand's view of what it is to lack pride. So I think those are, and that's, you might call humility.
Aristotle thought moral perfection is possible.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty amazing. You don't hear a whole lot of that other than from Rand, as far as I know. All right. And a quick question I'll try to make quick again. So like there's a famous dormancy of Aristotle in the West, like until Thomas Aquinas unearths Aristotle. And so before that, the Arabs were enamored by Aristotle, and then they rejected Aristotle. That's kind of my understanding of history. And according to The Cave and the Light, the book aforementioned, the Europeans were still into Aristotle during that dark age, but it was his logic that they were into. It's induction that was kind of brought about by Aquinas and company. So is that true that Aristotle and his logic were explicitly still embraced in Europe during that period?
Yeah, so first, unearthing, that sounds like Aquinas dug some stuff up, right?
Sure.
So literally that didn't happen. He wasn't a guy with a shovel, but also he didn't find texts that other people didn't have. So it is the case that some Aristotelian texts, so first, there were some Aristotelian texts that were always or almost always available in Europe, even during the Dark Ages. And some of Aristotle's logic was either directly or through commentaries on it. And different things were available in different places at different times. It's a complicated story. I don't remember all the details, but it's not like no one had ever heard of Aristotle among the monks who heard of any literary figures. There was always some, and indeed was more Aristotle than there was Plato in terms of literal texts that we had by the authors for much of the Dark Ages. But it was, largely logical works. It wasn't the natural scientific works in particular. And it wasn't all of, it was a relatively small segment of the corpus. There was a period then where a lot of, and this in part had to do with the Crusades and interactions with the Arab world and so forth, the Muslim world, where more and more Greek texts came into Christendom. The Christian scholars had access to more of them. This included a lot of Plato and a lot of Aristotle, more Aristotle, and included in particular a lot of Aristotle's scientific works. There was a guy, Albert the Great, Big Al, Albertus Magnus, who was the first kind of real one to study Aristotle's scientific works or make a big deal of them. Then you have Aquinas kind of systematizing it all and connecting it with Christianity more, not only his biological works, even not especially them, but a greater scope of Aristotle's works than had been before, and creating a kind of fusion Christian Aristotelian philosophy. So that's what Thomas did. It's not so much discovering texts, although some had been discovered in the years leading up to his work, but more making it respectable again and injecting it into the kind of main line of thought at the time.
Mark snuck in a final question. Difference between Aristotelian and Neo-Aristotelian?
Well, I mean, neo just means new. So Aristotle's been gone a long time. You can call any of the revival projects of Aristotle Neo-Aristotelian. It tends to be used for people nowadays. I mean, no one today, I hope, endorses slavery, endorses Aristotle's views of women. Very few people endorse his particular views about God, and so forth. So Neo-Aristotelian is the name you can use for any of the movements that are reviving what they regard as essential in Aristotle, but jettisoning a lot along the way that they either regard as inessential or just as wrong. Mm-hmm. And in particular, there's the Neo-Aristotelian school of virtue ethics, you might call it, which are people who study virtue with, a lot of inspiration from Aristotle. And there are also people doing kind of Neo-Aristotelian projects in metaphysics, where they're focused on causal powers and things like that. And that's how you put it. And you can call that Aristotelian if you want. What the Neo just does is it differentiates it from literally Aristotle's views, which few people are trying to, resuscitate all of.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hey, well, this was wonderful, Greg. Thank you for coming by, and good to see some new faces in the chat, presumably here because of the topic and the guest. Hope to see all of you here in the future. Coming up today at 7 p.m. UK time, it's the Fountainhead Book Club open to members with special guest Shoshana Milgram. So hit that join button here on YouTube or at the link to the website, become a member there to access that book club. Then at 10 p.m. UK time, it's Discovering Great Plays with Anne Chikalela, Shoshana Milgram, Mark Pellegrino, and Kirk Barbera. And today's play is Saint Joan by George Bernard Shaw. Good stuff. Thank you all. Thank you, Greg, and hope to speak again soon.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye all.
All right. Bye, everybody.